Hello students, I am Dr. Raju Pargi, Assistant Professor, Department of English and Modern European Languages, University of Allahabad. I am presenting Module 36 of Paper 2 on behalf of Professor Sumita Parmar, Director, Center of Women's Studies, University of Allahabad. The title of the module is Black Feminist Criticism. Black feminist criticism theory provides us with an empirical worldview, but a worldview that is never completely objective, since it emanates from certain assumptions, values and interests. Feminist theory, which is about 6 decades old, is also a way of viewing the world, concerned as it is with ending the oppression of women. It emerges from the large volume of women's writing produced in the last few centuries, consciously critiques that writing and attempts to utilize the experiences and insights earned by women to end their subjugation. An important point to bear in mind in radical feminist Charlotte Bunn's words is that we must not assume that there is any one core female experience, and instead view diversity of women as the center from which we then explore commonness. With this perspective, feminist criticism becomes grounded in the everyday lives of women. Though the oppression of women across all ethnic and radical boundaries, and all feminists are essentially writing, in Alice Walker's words, one huge story, their perception and the oppression they write about are not identical. Women are not homogeneous or monolithic category. White feminism has overlooked this crucial factor, presuming that white heterosexual women's writing speaks for everyone. This appropriation of the role of spokeswomen has in fact silenced non-white women's voices. Consequently, critical texts have often established an unconscious and unarticulated complicity between the author and the reader, that the world is white and heterosexual. White feminist criticism writes out the voices of the other woman just as it was written out of the literary male canon. Some of the most important texts written in 1960s and 1970s on the subject: Mary Ellman's Thinking About Women in 1968, Patricia Mayer Spack's The Female Imagination in 1975, Alan Moore's Literary Women in 1976, and Ellen Showalter's A Literature of Their Own, British Women Novelists from Bronte to Lessing, written in 1977, can hardly be characterized as representative. Indeed, the biggest failure of white feminism has been its inability to recognize differences, and ironically, white feminists are guilty of the same appropriations they accuse the men of. So, though sexism may be challenged in the male world, racism and ethnocentricity might not be. To women of color, a feminism which denies the realities of race and class differences, and which treats woman as a unilateral category, is at the very best inadequate and partial. Thus, black feminist criticism finds itself in a layered erasure. First, feminist criticism is written out of a male literary canon, and then black feminist criticism is written out of the white feminist canon. Nellie Y. McKay presents the case in the following words: deliberately written out of history for centuries, the recorded stories of generation of black women were, at the beginning of 1970s, largely unknown and considered of no value to anyone except to black women themselves. In fact, the entire corpus of writings about black people by white authors was replete with images of black womanhood, encapsulated within the confines of a few select images. Predominant among them was the figure of the black woman as caregiver and nurturer, the mammy. Portrayed as a big-breasted rotten figure symbolic of the nurturance of Mother Nature, the mammy was an umbrella term that covered the roles of housekeeper, nurse, nanny, and all else related to this domain. Contrapuntal to the figure of the mammy was the figure of the vamp, a siren, who provided the sexual quotient, was licentious, immoral, lured men to the paths of wickedness, and enabled the white master, if he so desired, to vent his lasciviousness, which he was not able to do in his marriage, where the codes of conduct were clearly defined and any deviation from the conventional was not acceptable. There was also the Spitfire, the Aunt Jamina, who emasculated the black men with taunts and verbal assaults, sassy and resourceful. Straddling the white and the black worlds was the figure of the mulatta, a woman born of a white father and a black mother, a character common in literature written by whites and blacks. The mulatta was generally a figure of tragedy, coming of two worlds and unable to belong to either one fully. These were some of the images found in the literature written about the black community in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It is important to note that these same images were also to be found in the writings of the major black male writers of the times, some of whom were thought to be pandering to the white man's voyeuristic tendency to see extreme sexuality in black women. Among the most acclaimed of these writers was Ralph Ellison, who won the National Book Award for The Invisible Man, a book where the central thematic concern is the black man's search for identity. Besides a few black women marginal characters, there is only one positive female character who hails from the south and looks after the protagonist after he returns from the hospital. This seems to be her only contribution to the novel, since she disappears from it after that. The women characters of Chester Himes, who wrote detective novels, the Harlem detective novels, were of all ages, shapes and hues, raucous, outspoken and often violent. They dress in vivid colors and wear an abundance of jewelry and makeup. They are characters that many readers at first sighting find comical, vulgar, or at least excessive. Similarly, James Baldwin too gave his women characters only passing attention, while the existence of Richard Wright's women characters was largely in relation to men, as relative be they husbands, fathers, sons, or lovers. Thus, black women were depicted as queens and princesses, or as earth mothers and idealized big mamas of superhuman wisdom and strength. Unrecognizable as individuals, the real and living black woman, the actual being, or rather the actual human being, with all her strengths and foibles, with her shortcomings and idiosyncrasies, multifaceted and trying to survive in the world of the heaviest odds, racism, sexism and poverty, was absent, and there was no one to tell her story. A key question is put by Mary Helen Washington. She asks, why is the fugitive slave, the fiery orator, the political activist, the abolitionist always represented as black men? How does the heroic voice and the heroic image of the black woman get suppressed in a culture that depended on her heroism for its survival? However, even though coming from a slave past and despite the cruel constraints that thwarted all creativity in them, black women along with their men preserved their collective wisdom and culture in an oral tradition through stories and songs and poetry, passing on their knowledge to the younger generations. In fact, till only 100 years ago, it was believed that there was no written tradition of black women's writing. But black feminist scholarship has been able to establish that there indeed existed an extraordinary African American women's literary tradition dating back to 1746. In that year, Lucy Terry wrote Bar's Flight, which is considered the first published poem by a black woman. Over the years, Linda Brent, Elizabeth Keckley, Charlotte Forten, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Churchill Terrell, and Ida B. Wells were some of the illustrious names that contributed to the growth of that tradition. From the second half of the 20th century, there was a spurt in the writings of novels, drama, and poetry by black women, further strengthening this tradition. They began to write the stories that black women wanted to read, the stories that no one else was writing. Several writers were explicit about why and what they wanted to write. I wrote Sula and The Bluest Eye because they were the books I had wanted to read. No one had written them yet, so I wrote them, said Toni Morrison. Gloria Naylor was equally clear. She says, I wrote what I felt I had to write, and I am willing to put my own sanity and my reputation behind it. Within a short span of time, tenacious and dedicated scholars rejected the boundaries of previously accepted knowledge and forged beyond them to excavate materials so that the literary, historical, and political landscape of world literature was enormously altered and enriched. However, it was only from 1970s when Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993, Alice Walker's The Third Life of Grange Kaplan, and Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings were published, that black women writers drew the attentions of both the reading public and the literary establishment. Nikki Goviani, Gloria Naylor, Toni Cade Bambara, Lucille Clifton, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Sonia Sanchez are only some of the names that have won acclaim over the last few decades. As feminist critic Hortense Spillers put it, the community of black women writing in the US can now be regarded as a vivid new fact of national life. Scholar and critic Henry Louis Gates Jr. endorsed Spiller's statement claiming that black women's literary movement, it seems safe to say, already has taken its place as a distinct period in Afro-American literary history and could very well prove to be the most productive and sustained. The corpus of the work is impressive in the sheer variety of styles, perspectives, and choice of subjects. But the overarching concern is the marginalization of the black woman, the articulation of her voice, and the rendering of her experience as valid, says Gail Jones. When you tell a story, you automatically talk about tradition, but they are never separate from the people, the human implications, for you are talking about language. You are talking about politics and morality, and economics and culture. You are talking about all your connections as a human beings. Toni Morrison's novel Sula was the first novel that had as its central theme the friendship between two women. Sula and Neil. Alice Walker, in her prize-winning novel The Color Purple, addressed the twin themes of sexism within black community and lesbianism. The novel was met with outrage and hostility by many belonging to the black community who saw the novel as a betrayal of community and a pandering to the white world. The understanding was the irrespective of the widespread sexism prevailing within the community, women were not expected to expose this reality to the wider world. Walker transgressed this expectation. As it happened, The Color Purple went on to become a national bestseller, winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1983, the National Book Award, and international acclaim as well. Perhaps the most meaningful achievement of African American women writers is that of having established the historical and cultural visibility of the black woman in the face of white and black sexism. Alice Walker has done pioneering work in resurrecting and re-establishing old and lost authors. Zora Neale Hurston, writing in 1930s, a brilliant writer, unapologetic and proud of her use of black English and idioms in her novels, is a conspicuous example, says Walker. We are a people. A people do not throw their geniuses away, and if they are thrown away, it is our duty as artists and as witnesses for the future to collect them again for the sake of our children, and if necessary, bone by bone. The need for a black feminist criticism arose with the growing corpus of the writings of black women. Since their work is linked by a commonality of themes and their intentions bound by a common vision, similarly, the aesthetics used by these artists are also akin. Black literature, in fact, stems from a storytelling tradition of oral literature. Toni Morrison explains, "There are things that I try to incorporate in my fiction, that are directly and deliberately related to what I regard as a major characteristic of black art, whatever it is, one of which is the ability to be both print and oral literature, to combine those two aspects so that the stories can be read in silence, of course, but one should be able to hear them as well. The rhythm and structure of black English is so typical and different that it becomes an effective tool to establish authenticity of both characters and tone. Black woman's language is, according to Barbara Smith, is distinct and able to communicate nuances and shades in the writings, not possible in mainstream language. The use of black woman's language and cultural experiences in books by black women about black women results in a miraculously rich colosseum of form and content, and also takes their writing far beyond the confines of white male literary structures. Thus, the use of black speech and its utilization to create a vibrant interaction between the reader and the text is a major common device. Not only do these writers draw upon the spoken language, but they also use expressions of black music like jazz, events in history, and religious and cultural symbolism. Often in the fictional canvas, an ancestral figure looms large, a comforting and reassuring presence. Songs of Solomon and Sula are the examples. The community plays an integral role as part of the structure of many of these novels. Women of Brewster plays, Sula, Songs of Solomon, the third Life of Grange Copeland. Thus, from disinheritance to resurrection, then on to addressing complex issues such as incest, sexism within the community, black women writers are playing a pivotal role. Now, within this framework, black feminist criticism has emerged as a specific branch of feminist criticism that critiques the writing of black women. The question to be asked is, what are the paradigms and structures within which the writings are to be assessed? What exactly would constitute black feminist criticism? Barbara Christian, 1943 to 2000, who was professor of African American Studies at the University of Berkeley and wrote the seminal black feminist criticism in 1985, asks fundamental questions that every critic must inevitably ask herself. What is a literary critic? A black woman critic? A black feminist literary critic? Talking about her own methodology of assessment, she wrote, "There is no absolute way to tell what's good or bad. I try to hear a writer's voice, or more precisely the one she has gotten on the page in comparison to the one she might have in her head. Then I try to situate that in a tradition that has evolved some approximate ways of how that gets written down best. Every critic knows one thing: writing is a complex activity. According to Mary Evans, there have to be a specific paradigms that cover the creative work of black women writers. And I quote, "I insist that black poetry, black literature if you will, be evaluated stylistically for its imagery, its metaphor, description, onomatopoeia, its polyrhythms, its rhetoric, What is fascinating, however, is that despite the application of all these easy criteria, no allegation of universality can be imposed, for the simple reason that black becomes a catalyst, and whether one sees it as a color, a substance, an ancestral bloodstream, or as a lifestyle, historically, when a black is introduced, things change. The black feminist critic would have to be a person able to see the writings holistically with all their nuances and ramifications. Aware of the daring spirit of the works themselves, she would be constantly aware of the political implications of her work and would assert the connections between it and the political situation of all black women. Logically developed, black feminist criticism would owe its existence to a black feminist movement, while at the same time contributing ideas that women in the movement could use. Elaborating further and outlining what this criticism would entail, it is worthwhile to quote Smith at length as she delineates just how a black feminist critic might approach the writing of black women. Beginning with this, with a primary commitment to exploring how both sexual and racial politics and black and female identity are inextricable elements in black women's writings, she would also work from the assumption that black women writers constitute an identifiable literary tradition. She would also be able to recognize that thematically, stylistically, aesthetically, and conceptually, black women writers manifest common approaches to the act of creating literature as a direct result of the specific political, social, and economic experience they have been obliged to share. Motifs of the ground realities of everyday living, motifs of the ground realities of everyday living, of quilting, of song, of herbal medicine, typical black activities would be woven into the work. Therefore, one of the functions of black feminist criticism would be to reveal for the first time the profound subtleties of this particular body of literature. Marking the absence of many voices in feminist criticism, Bell Hooks, in her book Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, wrote about how feminist criticism must make place for different voices and how women needed to acknowledge their differences while still accepting each other. However, the current academic world had recognized black feminist criticism as a significant part of mainstream feminist criticism, and black feminist critics continued to critique the rich and compelling work of black women writers as they narrate the story of the black woman. Thank you.